All right, welcome back. Now we have a firing weapon, but we have to click the mouse button every time we want to fire. And weapons are so much more fun when you can just hold the button down and get a whole bunch of bullets spilled out onto the screen. So we're going to make our machine gun an automatic. Now, in order for our gun to be automatic, we need to know when the fire button is pressed. That way, when the gun is finished firing, we can check to see if that fire button is still pressed, and then we can fire again automatically. We also need to know if we can fire. We're going to need some sort of fire delay, some amount of time we have to wait between firing bullets, even if that time is very short. So we'll have a couple of booleans here that will tell us when the above are true. So let's get started. All right, I'm here in FPS character, and here's my input action fire. Now already I'm starting to see that this needs some reorganizing. We're doing all of this stuff, and I think this should all go into its own function. So let's go ahead and highlight all of these nodes and right-click and collapse to function. And I'm going to call this function fire weapon. Now, of course, if we go into fire weapon, it still looks a bit disorganized, so we'll get to that later. But let's go back to the event graph for now. Now we have input action fire, and we have pressed and released. We should know when the fire button is pressed and when it's released, so we're going to create a boolean for that. So let's create a new variable, and I'm going to call this fire button pressed. And this is going to be a boolean. Now with our input action fire, we should be setting the value of fire button pressed so we know at all times whether it's pressed or released. So we're going to use a setter. I'm going to select that and Control W so we have two setters and hook these up to pressed and released. And in pressed, we want to set the value of this to true. So I'm going to check that box and leave it unchecked for released. So that's step one. We now know if our fire button is pressed. We also need a boolean from whether or not we can fire. And that boolean should be false while we're waiting for that delay period between rounds. So we're going to add another boolean, and I'm going to call this can fire. Now we need to check this can fire boolean. We're going to go into fire weapon. And the first thing we're going to do is check to see if we can fire. So let's add a branch, hook that up, and only do all of the following nodes if the condition is true. And the condition is going to be can fire. So if we can fire, we will fire and do all these other things we're doing. However, if can fire is false, we will not. Now, as soon as we check can fire and it's true, we should set it to false. So that way we can't fire again until can fire is set back to true. So let's set can fire and leave it unchecked. So we're setting can fire to false. That's the first thing we're doing. So this gives us a sort of throttle so we can't just spam the button and fire the weapon faster than the fire delay. Speaking of fire delay, let's add a new variable for that. I'm going to go back to the event graph and let's add a new float, and we'll call this fire rate. So this will be the rate of fire. This is how fast our automatic weapon can fire, and it's going to be a float. And we can compile and set this to a value. I'm going to set it to 0.1 seconds. So as we're firing our weapon, we can fire 10 times a second, basically. So what we can do is as soon as we've pressed the fire button, we're setting fire button to pressed, and we're calling fire weapon. Now, remember, fire weapon checks to see if we can fire. And the first time we press the button, we should be able to fire. So let's select can fire and set its default value to true so it starts off true. That way, the first time we fire, it's true, we can fire, and in fire weapon, we're setting it to false immediately. Now, we're not going to set that back to true until we've waited for our delay time. So we're going to use a delay here. And for our duration, for the delay, we're going to use fire rate. This means we have to wait at least 0.1 seconds until we can fire again. Now, what do we want to do after that? Well, as soon as 0.1 seconds is over, we should set can fire back to true. So let's set that, check the checkbox. Now we can fire again. Okay, so this is all still semi-automatic. We press the fire button, we check to see if we can fire, can fire is by default set to true, but in fire weapon, we set it back to false and then fire the weapon. Then we set the delay, we wait for 0.1 seconds, and then can fire is set back to true, and then we can click the fire button again, our left mouse button. So how do we make this automatic? Well, that's simple. We can loop this, but we only want to call fire weapon again if we're still pressing the fire button. So we're going to add a branch. I'm holding the B key down and left clicking. And for my condition, it's going to be fire button pressed. If fire button is still pressed, then we can loop this. We'll go back to calling fire weapon again. Now I need to add a reroute node so that I can see that this is actually looping back like that. So here's what happens. We press the fire button. Let's say we're holding it down. The first time we fire, can fire is true. So then we go into fire weapon, we check can fire, it's true, so then we set it back to false and fire the weapon. Then, after fire weapon, we hit the delay node, which will cause us to wait for 0.1 seconds. After which, we set can fire back to true and then check to see if our fire button is still pressed. If it is, we go back to calling fire weapon, and it will succeed because after our delay, we've set can fire back to true. So we should see the weapon firing every 0.1 seconds. That's the fire rate, 0.1. Let's test this out. All right, here we go. Wow, that is amazing. All right, I'm going to shoot these guys. Got one. And I got the other one. Perfect. So we now have automatic fire. But you didn't think you were going to get out of this lecture without a challenge, did you? Your challenge is to organize the fire weapon function. We're doing a lot of things in there. So use a sequence node to do one thing at a time and collapse each group of nodes into a function as you see fit. Go ahead and pause the video and clean up the fire weapon function. All right, so I'm going to double-click fire weapon and go back into the fire weapon function. Now, I'm going to add a sequence node here. So let's drag off a fire weapon, type sequence, and the first thing we can do is check can fire and set can fire. Those can be their own part of the sequence. Now, the next thing we're doing is spawning a muzzle flash. That could be the second thing. And I'll add a new pin, and we'll play the sound 2D. That'll be the next thing we do. So I'm going to bring that down here and hook that up. Let's add another pin, and we'll do the fire montage. Let's get that function and bring that down here. That'll be the next thing we do. And then we'll add another pin and do all this stuff. So we're performing the line trace, and we're calling apply damage here. We're also spawning the emitter at the location. So what I think I'll do here is I'll make a function for performing the line trace. And I'm going to include this calculation as well as breaking the hit result. Now here's what happens if I highlight these nodes, including the hit result. Notice we have our output execution wire, and we have an impact point and a hit actor here. These will be added as outputs for our function. So let's right-click, collapse the function, and look at that. We have the impact point and the hit actor as outputs. I'm going to call this perform line trace. Now, our perform line trace provides the information for our spawning the emitter and for applying damage. And I can add a reroute node so that I can see where this blue wire goes. So that looks good. So I think these are organized enough. I'm going to grab this group here and bring it over to our sequence, and that will be the next thing we do with our last then for pin. And of course, you can organize these to your heart's content until you have them looking just right. Okay, that looks great. Now, if we place this branch where we're checking can fire in its own sequence, then this defeats the purpose of preventing the rest of the nodes with our branch, because even if we execute the then one line of execution while can fire is false, then yes, the true execution wire will never be reached. So we'll stop at the branch,
but the sequence will then continue with then 1. So there's a handy node we can use to exit out of the function early in the false case. We can drag off of false and type return and add a return node. A return node will stop the function here. It'll simply finish the function without executing the rest of the sequence. It's an early exit. Now we can check to make sure CANFIRE is working properly. Remember, CANFIRE is designed to prevent us from firing too soon. Let's take our fire rate variable and set it to a large value, say 1 second, and compile. And if we hit play, then if we try to spam the fire button and click as fast as we can still only fire once every second. So I'm clicking the left mouse button as fast as I can, and we're hitting the return node when CANFIRE is false. So I'm going to set my fire rate back to 0.1 and compile.
Now, before I wrap this up, if you're feeling like your muzzle flash is a little too big and it's still sort of blinding you, we can come back to our spawn emitter at location here for our spawn muzzle flash function, and we can scale this down. I'm going to scale it to 0.25 in X, Y, and Z. And now it's a bit smaller. I think that's a little bit easier to handle. All right, so our gun is now an automatic, which is amazing. This is much more fun, right? You can just hold the left mouse button down and fire a whole bunch of bullets to your heart's content, and there's no way to run out of ammo, which is kind of a problem. So that's one of the next things we're going to cover is ammo, so that we don't have unlimited bullets. Great job. I'll see you soon.